Well, welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
We're all thrilled to have you for the keynote, and
Thank you.
welcome to your son as well, Carlos, who's over there. I hope you're all having a wonderful time today at the Responsible Investing Forum. Raimi gave some of your biography. We'll be getting in depth a little bit as well throughout the program, but I first thought it might be a time to give us some thoughts on former President George H.W. Bush as he is now at Capitol Hill.
You know, he probably has the most accomplished resume in U.S. politics. The amazing thing is that you don't read a lot about it. He never wrote his big biography. That's just the value that he grew up with. And even though I worked for his son, George W., even though he had a bit of a Texas swagger, he had those same values. He never bragged, modesty, and the whole family has that. And I think that's probably his biggest legacy. If you asked him, he'd probably say, my family.
And I know we heard from one of our earlier guests about his work on climate, that was a very important time on climate and climate change. And of course, some of that may be being rolled back right now.
Yeah, President Bush, 41, was the ultimate internationalist. Remember, he had this vision for a new world order. He saw the world as countries as equal, getting together, making progress, doing joint projects, but very much an internationalist vision, which is kind of the opposite of what you have today.
Well, we'll get to that. Speaking of vision, this was something that you had at Kellogg. Carlos started at Kellogg at 20 years old, if you can imagine a little 20-year-old Carlos. And I want to embarrass him a little bit now by reading something from 2004 in Fortune magazine. Since becoming CEO of the cereal giant, the Cuban native has transformed a lumbering, insider, volume-obsessed company into an innovative, profit-focused powerhouse admired by Wall Street and Walmart alike. Gutierrez has done all that by taking the slick salesmanship, financial discipline, and marketing savvy that he learned in his youth and blending it with disarming charisma, steely resolve, and an utter lack of pretension that you wouldn't expect in one so nattily dressed. So, with that, you created two strategies that have become part of the management canon: volume to value and managing for cash. And I'm curious as to how you responsibly lead a company, because you clearly had it figured out.
Well, you know, they say that every great strategy starts with a simple insight. And our simple insight was that we had historically chased volume. And it's not unlike automobile companies. If you ask them how much they sell, they'll usually answer the question in units. If you asked us 10 years ago how much we sold, we'd probably answer in pounds or kilos. But when you're chasing volume, you invest in capital to get the volume. You usually discount volume so you can get your volume growing. You design products that are made for volume and not for margin. So it takes over the whole company. And going from volume to value simply said, every report we have that measures volume, change it, it's going to measure dollars. And it changed the way we managed the business. It changed everything we did.
Now, you managed Kellogg for the short term. Obviously, you were a CEO. Your main responsibility, particularly at the time, was to your shareholders, your consumers, and your employees. But you obviously also had a longer term vision for Kellogg. How missing is that in corporate America today?
I mean, I think most CEOs will strive to have a long term and a short term. And, you know, back then there was also the question, are companies too focused on the short term? I never felt that that was a problem. You can't have a long term without a short term, and you can't have a short term without a long term. You've got to do both. And that's what makes business so difficult, is that you have to do both. And sometimes they're a bit conflicting. I would say the biggest problem is not so much that you have to report quarterly earnings, that you're held accountable for quarterly earnings. I think the biggest problem is unrealistic targets. So that, you know, companies throw out double-digit EPS growth. Why? Because that's what people want, because that sounds right. And then in order to make double-digit EPS and hit the quarterly numbers, they do some pretty crazy things. In my old business, they'll load the trade, which means at the beginning of the next month they won't sell much, and they load the trade at a discounted price. So I think it comes back to, and this is in the boardroom as well. When you get a board pushing for stretch targets, for me that's a sign of caution, especially if they put the stretch targets in their budget and they feel like they have to hit those numbers.
How do you transfer that mindset to the public sphere? Now, you obviously went from a company of about 33,000 employees to a department of about 40,000, so roughly similar size. You then have different responsibilities, or do you?
In commerce.
In commerce.
Yeah, I always felt, I get asked sometimes, what is more difficult, the public sector or the private sector? And hands down, I would say the private sector. Because you're measured with numbers. I used to tell my people, your legacy will be shown in a bar chart, and that bar chart won't have any footnotes. We're all about numbers in your own business. It's market share, it's daily sales, weekly market share, quarterly earnings. You're always under the gun. You're in a pressure cooker. In the public sector, it's more about how you're perceived. Are you perceived to be a strong leader? Are you perceived to be a good public servant, which is a little bit easier to manage than cold, hard numbers.
And I think we're seeing that very obviously now when, there's a president and administration that sends out tweets and, short-term GDP boost or stock market boost tends to be the thing that's focused on as opposed to maybe the long-term health of the economy.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised. It seems like investors are ready to jump on anything that sounds like good news. So President Trump and President Xi had a nice dinner in Singapore. In Argentina. Things didn't get worse. Market's up 280 points. Mexican president decided to pay bondholders. He's paying his debt. Whoa, Mexican peso's up, the stock market's up. And we're talking about a stock market that is at historically high levels. So it's puzzling why investors are so willing to just jump in at the hint of some good news.
Well, let's just talk about that for a moment, because we did get sort of a breakthrough in quotation marks on trade, at least a very short-term one, potentially. Is the president's strategy smart here?
I think what we got in Argentina was a delay. We punted a decision to sometime next year. I doubt that China is going to surrender. And frankly, I doubt that we're going to surrender. So this thing is here to stay unless we decide to do something like perhaps a series of principles that will govern the future relationship. The president is very focused on trade deficits. I don't want to be disrespectful, but it's the wrong problem we're focused on. That's not the problem. Our trade deficit declines when our economy is weak. So the last time our trade deficit had a huge decline was during the Great Recession. Our trade deficit is growing right now. Why? Because our economy is strong. So it's part of our model. And I frankly doubt that the trade deficit will decline in 2019. So the president's going to have to find a way of declaring victory, and the Chinese will have to find a way of saving face. I don't think that's going to happen in the near term.
At the same time, when you were CEO of Kellogg, you had every right to be a Kellogg first person.
Yes.
To the extent that the country can be similar in some ways in terms of responsibilities and efforts, is the president does he have a point in saying America first in this instance? After all, it's been 20 years since all of the multilateral efforts that you made. Are there things that China needs to be reined in on?
Oh, there's no question that we need to push China on intellectual property, on data localization, on data transfer. And it's not like we haven't been doing that. We've been doing that for 20 years since they joined the WTO, but just in a different style, in a different way. Many of you know Chinese history, and you'll know that the way they see the world is that in 1949, when Mao took over, that was the end of the 100 years of humiliation. And that 100 years of humiliation included some very one-sided trade deals with Japan, included the Opium Wars, where China was forced to buy opium at gunpoint. They remember that history. They remember it extremely well, and they're not going to let it happen again. And especially President Xi, who has been given a third term. He may be president for life. His name is in the Constitution. It's the wrong time to try to humiliate someone into a deal.
So what should be done? And on that note, is there any advantage to bilateral deals as opposed to multilateral deals? Would you still be a multilateral deal internationalist?
Sure. You know, when we were doing trade deals under President Bush, we were criticized because we were doing too many bilaterals. So we did Singapore, Chile, Colombia. We did one regional, which was Central America. I don't think it makes a big difference. Frankly, I think you can do multilateral, you can do bilateral. Bilateral is easy because you have fewer variables and fewer countries with interest. But I don't think that's the problem. You know, I don't think that's the big issue we need to solve today. I worry that we are celebrating too much about bringing steel back. And by the way, I love that, and I admire people in the steel industry. But is that the future? Or should we be talking about what are we going to do when these new technologies take millions and millions of jobs? That's the risk. But we're talking about, you know, bringing manufacturing back, not letting autos go overseas, bringing steel back. That's all very noble, but that's not the future.
You mentioned the trade deficit a moment ago. Let's talk about the deficit overall. You're a counter-cyclical guy. You spent money at Kellogg when everything was, you know, going downhill, and it worked, right? It was the perfect solution for Kellogg. Do you like the idea of an infrastructure plan now?
No. I think, you know, it reminded me a little bit of of when President Obama took over. The big buzzword was infrastructure, and it was shovel ready, and we're going to create jobs. I understand that. It's a one-time thing. It's a bit tactical, but our unemployment is 3.7%. I mean, are we in a mad hurry to create jobs because our unemployment is too high? And frankly, our deficit is getting close to 6%. Our fiscal deficit between 5-6%. You can't. I mean, we're about as tight as we can get. So it's either more revenue, which means that 3% growth continues, and that's going to be tough next year because we have variables around the world that are not helping the 3% growth, or you raise taxes, which I don't think anybody wants to do.
But there are lots of people out there that want to invest in some public-private partnerships
Yes.
that the president has promised that would help, you know, upgrade infrastructure. What about doing it that way? So he's talked about 200 billion plus.
I mean, that could be a way of doing it. We traditionally have not led the world in public-private partnerships. It just hasn't been part of the model. Either the private sector does it. There isn't a good model to do public-private partnerships at scale in infrastructure. I think we have to figure out how to do it. We have to get a way of doing it based on our culture, based on how we do things. But there are countries that do it better than we do. And I would say a great public-private partnership for retraining millions of workers who are going to have to find a way of making a living when you've got artificial intelligence and robotics and everything else coming at you, which hasn't hit yet, but it will.
I want to ask you what your prescription for American renewal is then now, and maybe a subset of that, GOP renewal.
Oh, gosh. You know, American renewal, we are the largest economy, the most innovative economy. We have a culture of entrepreneurship where people take risks. If they fail, it's okay. They try again. We believe in free enterprise. We believe in the power of the individual. That's what we need for American renewal. We don't. The problem I have is that whatever we're doing today is not forward thinking. If making America great again is to take us back to the 60s, I don't want to go. In terms of the GOP, I think if the GOP stays as it is, and I've been a Republican all my life, if it stays as it is, I don't think it'll be around for a very long time, maybe a couple of decades. But this GOP is getting smaller and smaller every year. And the policies are, for many people, are repugnant. So I actually think that a lot of Republicans are going to have to do a lot of explaining about where were they, and what did they say? Did they speak up? So I think the GOP is in a lot of trouble. Unfortunately, I don't see the Democrats doing much. I don't know what the Democrats stand for. I heard somebody today say infrastructure spending. Come on, it has to be a bigger idea. Healthcare, that's an idea. There's a lot of different ideas out there, but I don't get exactly what the future Democrat Party is. I don't hear a lot of complaining. I haven't heard them call the president on, let's see that deal you made in Argentina. What are the issues of that deal?
You're not sounding very hopeful about the future of American politics, left or right.
Well, I mean, I think we're going through a time when we have a very strong president who is not, well, we have a president who doesn't shy away from being ruthless against enemies, right? Against people who criticize him. He uses that Twitter. He knows how to use it. And he's not ashamed of calling someone a name that goes to the heart of what hurts that individual the most. I think a lot of people want to avoid that. We're not seeing a lot of profiles in courage.
Where are you looking to then for leadership here? Is there anybody in the political spectrum, right across the spectrum, that you see maybe flashes of hope in?
This one's interesting, but I think the most interesting name that I've heard in the last couple of months is Mike Bloomberg. I don't agree with everything he stands for. Some things he's regulating the size of soft drinks and things like that. That's fine, but I think he would be a very good president.
Do I need to put in a disclaimer here, or are we good? All right. How do you, as a leader, look at other companies, and which ones are you admiring in terms of being both output positive and also internally good? You're on a lot of boards, from Occidental Petroleum to Time Warner, you name it practically. You've either been on them or you were on them. What companies are you admiring of?
My background is in packaged goods, and I understand that business. I understand how it works. I understand the margins and the dynamics. And we're going through a tough time in the food industry. It's hard to find, a food company that's really hitting it out of the park. Packaged goods, I was very pleased to see that finally Procter & Gamble seems to be coming back. They've reorganized. They have a new idea of the company. But companies I admire, United Technologies, I was on their board. They were neck-to-neck competitors against GE. Today they're 117 a share, GE's at 7. And then, who can not admire Apple? It's interesting that a company that size, they don't really do research. They don't really do basic research. They're not trying to discover the next big idea. They're trying to develop products that consumers like. They're not trying to develop the next big technology. So in many ways, it is like a packaged goods firm. It is like a consumer-driven company. And they've done a tremendous job in what I would call product development, not so much R&D, but product development.
Briefly, I do want to ask you, and then we'll get to questions. Does the US need to be concerned about the impact of its own governance on other economies?
Yes, you mean the way we govern? Yes, up until now, we've always been an example. And I say up until now because I'm not sure how this whole thing will shake out, but companies look to the U.S. to, how do they manage their boards, and how do they manage their congressional process, and how do they manage their interagency processes. And I don't know. I think the jury's out whether countries that try to emulate us would actually start to pull back a little. And that worries me, because that's not something you see. It's not something in the numbers, but it's a bit of an abstract notion that will hurt us 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now.
All right, hold it there. We are getting to some questions from everybody now, and our thanks for this portion to the Commerce Secretary. So I know you've been sending in your questions, and Lauren has some.
We're ready, Vonnie. Thank you. Does being a publicly listed company make it more difficult for foods companies to sell healthier foods and to be more sustainable?
I'm not sure about that. I think that if you're a public company and you want to sell sustainable foods and healthier foods, that's great. But people have to buy it. So if you were private, you would have to sell things that consumers want to buy. And I wouldn't see being a public company hindering that if what you're doing creates value.
What is the most important piece of advice you'd give a CEO today about integrating ESG?
Well, today it's very different than, and it's changing. There's no question it's changing. I find that, we're a country where we have trends and then we have counter trends. And it's fascinating the way our society works. So today, the biggest pressure on ESG, on climate change, on corporate governance, on diversity in the boardroom is coming from investors. So all the boards that I sit on have received a request to develop their emissions reduction plan, their climate change plan. So it's as if though, okay, we pulled out of Paris, so the investor community is actually filling the void. But the key is to make it part of the business plan and to integrate it in the business plan, as opposed to this is our business model and over here we have our ESG strategy.
So from your business career to your political one, if you were in the White House today, what would be your priorities?
I can tell you one.
Get the heck out. No. I think we have a lot of work to do with allies. I'm not talking about China now. I'm talking about Canada, Mexico, the UK, Germany, Australia, Japan. We have a lot of work to do in the sense that to convince people that it's not going to be America first forever, that we're not leaving the international system, that we're going to be a part of the system, that we're not going to leave countries alone. There's a great deal of fear in Asia that we're going to leave Asia alone, and therefore Asia will be subject to whatever China wants to do. So I think repairing that is probably priority number one.
One more and I'll let Vonnie have the final word. Would you say that President Bush was the single greatest term president? Single term president?
One-term president? Probably, yes. I believe so. I think he, again, the things that he did during the fall of the wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, the things he did to not let things get out of hand, countries with nuclear weapons basically crumbling, a system crumbling. Who's in charge? Who's got the military? Who's going to make the call? And he did this through sheer diplomacy, getting on the phone, trying to calm people down. The way he handled the Panama invasion, which a lot of people don't agree with, but people who observed him saw a master at work, someone who understands the military and understands how to put together a plan. The way he handled Desert Storm, it was just unbelievable. The organization, the speed, and then the ability to hold back the urge to go to Baghdad. I just think he is full of accomplishments.
All right. Thank you all for your questions and for your attention. And thanks
Thank you.
to former Commerce Secretary Carlos Gutierrez.
Thank you very much.